And hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Tectonic Lounge. We are brought to you by Code Engine Studio, our parent company. We focus on creating technology solutions to business problems, software development, and other ways. So today I have a special guest for us who is not a software developer per se, nor is he one of our clients or former clients. Michael and I attended the same university a few years back. We won't say how far back. But Michael is in the sphere of education. I believe he is in the Public Education Foundation. And tell us more, Michael.
I started my career as a math and computer science teacher, mostly so I could coach basketball, but also really enjoyed teaching. And after a decade or so, I found myself working for a Public Education Foundation. It's a local nonprofit. We support teacher and leadership development. And in particular, I lead a team called the Innovative Learning Team that does a lot of helping teachers and administrators integrate technology. And increasingly, we're consulting in the business world as well.
So in a sense, you do kind of what I do. You solve educational problems, or in their case, that's their business problems, but using technology in many, many ways.
That's right. I just recognize that technology is changing the world and it's rapidly evolving, and we can't use strategies that worked 20 years ago just simply won't work today. So we've got to constantly be thinking about how are we growing and evolving.
So let's start with that. Let's kind of piggyback on this idea that change happens. I went to university in last century. You were at school in the early 2000s, and then you got in as a teacher. We're not even going to get into the AI part of it, but overall, how do you feel technology has impacted education in 2024 and let's say 25, 26 that perhaps we weren't expecting, we weren't ready for?
Well, that's a loaded question. And yeah, I'll not get into AI, but I think that's coming. I think that's an inevitability. And maybe that's a piece we get to later. I think a few things. One is that as we look into sort of this school year, the coming years, what seems clear is that the rate of change, both in terms of the evolution of technologies that are available, that are ubiquitous in the market, whether it's in business or consumer level electronics, both the evolution of those electronics, how quickly they're evolving, improving, their capabilities are rapidly shifting, but also their adoption cycles are changing. We look back, and I was a student in school before the internet was prolific. It had been invented, but we basically had a 30-year run from the invention of the internet to the internet being a thing that everybody was using, and it was part of our everyday. Like nobody puts "I can use the internet" on my resume anymore, right? It's not a differentiator.
True story.
It's an expectation, right? But what we've seen in the last 25 years is that adoption cycle and the evolution of the technologies that are pervasive across the marketplace, whether in education or in manufacturing or healthcare or whatever industry. We've seen that evolution rapidly increase, right? So early 2000s, many times technologies run a 5 to 7 year adoption cycle where we went from kind of mobile phones to smartphones. And do I really need all this connectivity? I better have all this connectivity. And I think to touch briefly, I think AI is showing us the next iteration of that, where it's sort of generative AI comes into the public psyche a couple of years ago, and all of a sudden it's sort of feels like in the next 3 to 4 years, it may be a thing that you better be using, not you just heard about it.
Yeah, I would say 2 years ago, I know we're still coming off the highs and the lows of COVID, but I don't believe that even the people who were well-positioned were actively pursuing uses of AI. I mean, I don't think that was the case. On the other hand, we now have, going along with your adoption cycles, we have a generation of students that are, I don't want to say internet native. I think they're Web 2.0, Web 3.0 native, especially the ones in elementary and middle school now. They wouldn't know how to live without it, which I appreciate the fact that I knew how to do things without having to Google them. Even that's outdated, right? This idea of Googling things is becoming outdated because that's not the latest and the greatest way of doing it. So how do the educators, in your particular sense, take these kids who are incredibly comfortable with technology, probably more comfortable than their teachers are, and how do they harness that and prepare them for when they actually get out in the real world, the business world, the career world?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a multi-pronged issue, right? On the one hand, I think the lowest hanging fruit is we have a responsibility to equip students, to prepare youth, and whether that's K-12 or even in college, We have a responsibility to equip young people with the ability to use technology productively as creators, to use it in a way that in some way enhances their ability to accomplish tasks, not just simply for consumption of information, consumption of entertainment, right? So yes, many of our students are technology natives, but also there's a huge swath of students, a huge swath of young people who their primary, maybe their only interaction with technology is strictly through the lens of consumption and entertainment, which is not altogether useful in the business and industry community, right? It's not a skill that you can really leverage for the most part. There's some conversation we have, but generally speaking, that's true. So on the one hand, there's just the responsibility to equip students to use technology with intentionality, for purpose, for productivity, for things that are in some way adding value to the world around them, whether that's through creative expression or increased efficiency to accomplish specific tasks, whatever. That sort of usefulness of technology is important. I think the other side of what we see is that because the adoption or the evolution of technology, the rate of change across basically every sector of technology, but especially with what's happening with compute power in the last few years, that rate of change is really reminding, I think it's regrounding educators. And I think we're seeing this, my primary niche is certainly in the K-12 sort of education arena. But I think we're seeing this happening in HR departments across a wide range of businesses as well, that as we go to grow the workforce, we used to lean pretty hard into, and by used to, I mean like a couple of years ago, and in many ways still do, we lean pretty hard into this idea of sort of linear progression, that there are experts in the world who own information, whether that's people or websites or some resources, but there's information that's owned by a person or a group of people or a particular collection, and that information needs to be acquired by the students, right? Whether it's in the traditional student sense or an employee that's growing through professional learning. And once the people have sort of achieved a level of expertise, then they can add value to the world around them. I think so. So it was a very didactic, very linear experience. We viewed learning very linearly. I think what's increasingly true is the business community, and this is true in basically any sector, is now recognizing they need a workforce that is, they're looking for dynamic people in a workforce, people that have learned how to learn. We say a lot in our work that no one person can know everything, right? We carry more information in our pocket than any one person could ever possibly know. But what makes you valuable in business and industry, how you're able to sort of carve out a living, to add and contribute meaningful things to society, is what can you learn and do? So you may not know everything, but can you learn anything? Becomes a real grounding principle in how we are trying to approach both developing students and developing employees.
Yeah, you gave some really two very meaty thoughts that I want to jump on. One is, I think we used to focus, at least I remember the computer classes in some of the schools, even when I interned and did other places, learn how to use a piece of software, learn how to use a tool. You
Right.
need to know how to use Photoshop, FrameMaker, whatever, right? And I think that's become, again, the pace of change, pace of evolution, how much easier the tools have become, or how much smarter the tools have become, that we don't have to be experts in every single thing. Purely from my own example, back when I had a photography studio there on Hickson Pike, removing a background from an image in Photoshop was a 30 to 40-minute job. Now it's 2 clicks, and it's generally pretty dang good, right? So we went from let's push people to learn particular skills that were very much tied to a piece of software, which I think we're moving away from, and focusing on what is essentially not a new idea, right? We go back to the original university ideas. We want to create lifelong learners. We want to create lifelong capacity to absorb, process, and even share information. But I love your idea of the fact that it's a nonlinear thing, that you don't have to be 41, 45, 48 years old to help out folks around you and share that knowledge and bring value to your company, to your family, to your society. So I think that's a great idea, because I remember myself in my 20s where people were like, what do you know? You're a young whippersnapper. And I actually remember having a conversation with Tom Davis, who we both know. And the fact is, well, now that you're 31, now people are going to listen to you. And I think we've gotten to a point where people expect to be listened even earlier. And there's plus and minus with some of that there's some expectations coming into play where people have an ability to not see that maybe they don't have as much knowledge as they think they do. But
Sure.
okay. So pivoting from that, let's talk a little bit about we know we need soft skills. How does technology help us develop those soft skills? And what are the soft skills you feel have become even more accentuated with this growth in technology?
So you're getting right in my wheelhouse here, that we spend a lot of time in this space. In fact, we've stopped calling them soft skills and we've adopted language we call essential skills. Right? They're the skills that are absolutely essential and ubiquitous, right? They're highly transferable, they're durable. They're the skills that play across anything. So I think technology's role in that from a like human development standpoint, from a teaching and learning standpoint, is that technology really liberates instructors and students to be able to spend a little less time worried about product development, worried about sort of initial efficacy of solutions that are being developed, and spend a little more time actually giving intentional strategic feedback to those under our care, to those we lead, about how they're developing those essential skills. So we've actually, in our work, we started looking at, I've got a funky background behind me, I know. We started looking at these fab labs in schools, sort of picking up on the maker movement from the last 15 years or so, and really formalizing that. The media lab at MIT really did some profound work in sort of saying, this is, if you had these digital fabrication, so 3D printers, laser cutter, then you could make almost anything, right? That you could take any idea from your head and bring a minimum viable product version of that into fruition very quickly, right? So we started talking about rapid prototyping in the maker community and these sorts of things. Well, as that was evolving, what we realized was in the school context, when that's possible, you can start to really shift the narrative and the approach to how you grow students. So if a student has access to technology and to mentors such that they can actually make almost anything, then suddenly what the mentor can provide, what the teacher or the facilitator can really provide for them, is a construct where they get feedback about, how do I grow my skills around critical thinking, around creative problem solving, around effective communication, and perseverance and resilience and dependability and being a self-starter? To land there, we had some thoughts, but in our community, what we did, we had a team of us that went out. We surveyed over 100 business and industry leaders across our community, from really large automotive companies to really small kind of niche mom and pops. And we just asked them a simple question. What are you looking for that you can't find in the workforce? And full transparency, my undergraduate degree is in computer science. My partner in this work, his undergraduate was in systems engineering. We were pretty confident we were going to hear a lot of responses around, like, we need STEM, right? We need engineers, we need programmers, we need technical skills. Literally 100% of the responses we got were what I would have called soft skills growing up, right? Were those essential skills. They need employees who have learned how to learn. Most of them are running proprietary systems in their organizations. They don't need to know that you went to school and had a particular certification. That certification might prove you're capable, but they're still going to have to train you on their proprietary sort of enterprise solution, so that you've demonstrated the capacity to say, I can learn new things, new information, new skills, and I can apply that information and those skills in a given context. And I can leverage these essential skills like creative thinking, creative problem solving as I do that, so that I can work effectively, whether independently or part of a collaborative team. I can work effectively towards the organization's mission and goal. That's a subtle but substantial shift in how we think about education.
No, that's a huge shift, because if we go back to the traditional models of education, with especially lecture-based learning, or large, I went to a lecture at University of Pennsylvania with a classroom for 18,000 people. That's very different, right? And I think we were preparing people who are trained to sit and listen to lectures, sit in front of desks and output, regurgitate the same information over and over again, write long papers. And now we're saying what you said, we're developing, can you creatively solve problems? If we were to land on a completely different product, if we were to, launch something new, can you be the person to help it go forward, understand the markets, and then shift all that and apply the human part of it that technology can supplement?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the context matters. I mean, this is a nuanced conversation, so I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. I think there's value in academia I think there's value in having hyper niche experts. Those are the folks who oftentimes do the foundational research that results in the next discoveries that really do help revolutionize the world. If we don't have those experts being grown and having opportunity to really dive deep, then the world probably doesn't look. We don't have some of the real benefits and value that are present in the world today. So I think that's still important. I think what we've seen though is over the last 40 or 50 years, that became the primary focus: is how do we grow those specialists, where the workforce largely, especially in startups, needs generalists, right? It needs people who can quickly adapt and be agile. So I think there's space and necessity for both. But historically, certainly in the last generation or so, we sort of maybe overvalued how we built constructs to create, to sort of churn out specialists, and maybe undervalued the importance of generalists, though especially in capitalist communities, right? Generalists tend to find opportunities to thrive because they're so adaptable.
Right. I mean, if you think back to the, assembly line, aka Mr. Ford, you needed to be a specialist. You were doing that one particular job 1,000 times. That's right. It was not exactly the most mindful task. It was just do it well, do it over and over again, and don't screw it up. I think we've gone away from that. It used to be a slander to call somebody jack of all trades, master of none. And I think it is important to be able to be flexible. And I don't think this is brand new in the world. I think we go back to people who were able to take an entire life cycle of product and test it out, especially on a smaller scale, everything from food production to welding to whatever, where you can actually be able to do different jobs because you're the only one in your community who could do that particular task. Okay, so let me go to the area we said we're going to leave for later, which is AI. Yeah. And what I'm seeing is both the good and the bad part of it. Full disclosure, I'm married to a teacher, so I get to hear all the complaints about, ChatGPT writing half the papers. Sure. My answer is let the ChatGPT grade it then, and that make it even easier. But let's kind of dive in. We're saying we're preparing generalists who can apply that human touch, right? Being able to understand human intelligence, being able to understand human emotions in marketing. We had that on a previous episode of the show. Being able to interpret information differently than a machine would, and so on. How has, in the last, let's say the last 2 school years, really, when AI has made a difference, right? How has your view on AI evolved over the last 2 school years, and where do you see the next 2 school years taking the AI usage in education?
Oh, that's big. I'm going to do my best to be brief there, and there's lots of space for conversation in that lane for sure. I'd say for me personally, in the last couple of years, it's been all about possibility. I think what we're seeing, I've had the opportunity to give some presentations to school leaders and teachers around the country. And in that context, I think what we're seeing is a healthy dose of trepidation, right? It's not just, I mean, the easy piece is what you were talking about earlier. Like, obviously, we have to be mindful of our students using AI ethically, just like we have to be mindful of how students use any tool. Are they just cheating? Are they just having AI write the paper for them? At the end of the day, that probably is, that specifically as an example, is a call to sort of 2 pieces. On one hand, we might need to be thinking about, is giving a writing assignment the best way to assess learning? What's the actual point of the writing assignment? In some cases, we might default there in education where we shouldn't. And I think AI is making us think a little bit about, it's become a catalyst for us in education to really start thinking about, are we assessing learning in the best way possible for the particular goal? On the flip side of that, sort of the double talk there, oftentimes we know research is pretty sound on this, that the act of writing is critical to the learning process, that as we write things, just the act of writing, not necessarily being good at writing or writing for others or writing as a communication strategy, but just simply the act of writing. It's part of why scientists journal. When we write, we articulate ideas, right? We synthesize ideas. So if we just let AI do all of the writing, you could go to the extreme. AI is so good at writing. Let's just, ChatGPT should write everything for students. We should teach kids how to write strictly through ChatGPT. Well, then we rob them of the opportunity to engage in deep learning that writing is a profound part of. So I think we've got to be careful on both sides. So I currently see schools and school systems largely tiptoeing into that pond, right? They know it's there. They know they have to be mindful of it, but there's some real pitfalls. And I think it's evolving so quickly there. By the time school systems, which typically move pretty slowly, by the time an entire system makes a shift, the landscape has changed again. So I think it's a little bit difficult to predict over the next 2 years what exactly that looks like. I mean, just strictly my speculation. We're seeing a lot of third-party vendors that are wrapping or using GPT or other engines to build sort of third-party platforms that have some security in place, that have some pieces in place for student privacy and making sure students are filtering information. And I think that's not, this is not an exhaustive list, but I think that's another piece we've got to be really mindful of that I'm starting to see come out in education is just like when Google became a thing, right? When we could reliably search the internet. And then if you remember when Wikipedia became a thing, schools largely rushed to tell students, don't use Wikipedia. It's not valid information. This isn't a reliable source, not a strong academic source. And then over time, we started to go, well, actually, it's crowdsourced information that's cited. We should probably pay attention to this. I think we're going to see a version of that. But right now, we're seeing both extremes. We'll see schools say, no, lock this down. Kids can't use it all. Let's act like it doesn't exist. On the flip side, we're seeing students that are using ChatGPT in place of their search engine and not filtering, is this information reliable and valid? And they're just blindly acknowledging and then defending that, like, whatever the results are that it produced are accurate and true. So still the ability for the user, right? I mean, I think we have to think of technology always as a tool, and the value of that technology, value of any tool, is largely up to the capacity of the user. I think the challenge with, and I think some of the interesting conversation around the generative AI landscape, particularly in the education context, but probably in the business context as well, is that like it produces results and feedback with such confidence that particularly younger users just read it and go, well, that's true. And that's a little different than what we used to think about when we had to filter results from a Google or a search engine, whether it was Google or otherwise. So it's an interesting opportunity.
And I think, that we are still even though we have an amazing pace of evolution, right? An amazing pace of development. I mean, I have touched open stuff when it was version 2, and now we're 4.5 or whatever we're at. And there's a drastic change, and it's significantly heads and shoulders above where it was. But I think it goes back to what you said earlier, as far as developing those essential skills, those critical thinking skills, those assessment. And I think we need to say, okay, yeah, you have this new power tool, but you need to still understand the pitfalls and not try to scare them into it, because they're still going to use it. Right. But I think you're absolutely right. If we can say it's not about the tool. We had an episode earlier, I've mentioned it to folks before, with Andrew, who is a researcher from St. Andrews University, specifically on AI. And he talked about that he believes generative AI is an intermediary step from where we're going to get to. And he talked about some of the things that we will see in next X number of years, that it's not going to be prompt-based driven, right? It's not going to be, despite the fact all these companies popping up right now that are creating by a set of prompts, I think is the greatest little money-making temporary gimmick. But I think we're getting to a point where we need to understand, okay, if I have a tool in my hand, right? If I have a chainsaw, I need to use it well, or I'm going to cause harm, right? And if potentially lethal harm. And I think that we need to approach that way, and becoming those generalists who say, okay, what is the value of a tool? Where I'm seeing this, and I want to kind of get your feedback on this, both for students and for teachers, I am seeing that there's so many things we do that we don't find value in, that are routine, mundane tasks. Like you talked about the value in writing, right? But being able to, I was talking to a teacher today and said, well, yeah, I'm struggling with my seating chart. I said, well, have you considered automating that or outsourcing that to a machine? It's going to unemotionally create like 5 variations of seating charts for you. And he looked at me like, that's an idea. So, I mean, I think, can you talk about training the teachers, especially the ones that are, say, millennial and older, to be comfortable to try to say, what job parts can we make harder, or are the school systems not letting them, or are there other limitations?
I mean, there's definitely limitations, right? Policies and things like that. But I think that's a whole different bucket of work. Largely, where we've been playing with teachers is we've engaged with teachers, and I will say, I've been I tend to be pretty skeptical of systems in general because they tend to sort of be slow moving and it takes a while. So I tend to sort of be annoyed that they don't adopt as fast as possible. In this generative AI space, I'm seeing more momentum earlier than I've ever seen before. But like I said earlier, with a healthy dose of sort of trepidation, which is, I think, a good thing. I think with teachers and sort of the use case you just talked about, I think that's a really good example. So I immediately flashed back when you were saying that to, like, if you think back to like I don't know the right year, maybe 2005 or so, like everybody carried a flip phone and nobody had the same brand, right? It was like Motorola Razr and the LG chocolate and the slider phone. It wasn't just Apple and Android, right? It wasn't like 4 phones. It was 400 phones in the market, right? So that was when I started my teaching career. And I'll never forget. That's also right when phones could take pictures. And they weren't great, but they could like take color pictures for the first time. My mom asked me to show her how to take a picture and like send it to people, like text a picture to people. So I went over to the house and I sat with her. She pulled out a steno pad, right? She's a boomer. And she sits down and she's like, okay, so she's writing down the steps. So it's like menu, down, 8, like whatever. And she navigates the camera, takes the picture, then has to figure out how to find the picture, text it. And she's got 37 steps to text and take and text a picture. It occurred to me, I was teaching high school at the time. I thought, man, I wonder how my students would do this. So I went to class and I said, hey, let's try something real quick, guys. We took all the phones up, put them in a box, shook the box up, redistributed them at random. Nobody had read a manual. That was back when phones came with a manual. Nobody read a manual. They all picked up a different phone. They didn't have passwords on them back then. So every kid gets a phone. And I said, okay, your goal is as fast as possible. Take a picture and text it to yourself from whatever phone you have. And as you can imagine, like it's seconds, right? 10 seconds, 15 seconds, done. What had happened was those kids had figured out like they could think like a cell phone. They knew the general idea of how to set up because they didn't read the manual for their phone. They didn't memorize a sequential order of steps, right? They weren't following a recipe. They had built a construct in their mind like, I bet I'm going to find the camera somewhere in the menu. I'll take the picture. It's going to store it somewhere and I'll send it. So they could sort of play that procedure out, but not have to follow a procedural routine. With AI, I think we're going to see that sort of tenfold. I think the example you just gave is a perfect example of users not leaning into the uniquely human part of AI, which is the creativity side. Right? Like I have to be creative as a user to think, this would be an interesting application. I have a set of defined parameters. I have a specific goal. Generative AI could really play well here, right? It would have the meat that it needs to be able to do the ingredients it needs to cook something up for me. For the user, I think you develop that capacity not by reading documentation and following a script or buying 10 prompts from a company making money. You sign in and play, and you start to build that muscle. So you go, I can think like a cell phone now. So I could switch from GPT to Gemini to Copilot to Claude to whatever and start to go, okay, they all sort of are working the same way. I have a basic understanding of how these go. And in my professional workflow, whether I'm making seating charts or whether I'm trying to figure out a professional development plan for people in my organization or working through product development cycle, whatever that is, if I can see what ingredients the chatbot needs for it to produce a valuable and interesting, compelling result, like suddenly I'm thinking like a cell phone. I could take a picture and send it. I'm not restricted to a set of defined criteria and list. I think we have to really lean there, and that's been part of the nice thing. I think that was really, I don't know if that was intentional. I think it was really smart of some of these companies to come out with sort of these freemium experiences the last couple of years to build a user base. They're like, okay, I'll play. I can play for free. And then if I see the value, if I experience value, then I can pay to upgrade and unlock maybe more uses, more features, whatever.
Yeah, I think there's a generational thing where those of us who are older than millennials or even the older part of millennials are a little more afraid to play because of the unknowns. And I think that's always happening. And I think we are always going in that pendulum between specialization and generalization. Like as you were talking, I was thinking about, I had an auto mechanic years and years ago when I was in high school. That guy didn't care what your car was. I mean, he repaired any kind of car, but he hated the cars with computers in them because they got too specialized. But any kind of mechanical car, he's like, I don't care what the brand is. I know how it's supposed to work in general. So I'll find the whatever's making that noise. And I do appreciate the thought of, this idea of ingredients and being able to process things. So we don't necessarily need a set of recipe books. Here are the exact 6 steps to get the perfect prompt. But if we define it, if we start interacting with it, assigning personas to it, doing all kinds of things, it is kind of like going on Chopped, where they give you a box of ingredients saying, what can you make with it? Right.
Right.
And I think that we get to that. And again, as long as we are still engaged as humans and we're not just taking the result that's given to us and going, there you go, it's good, let's just run with it. Because even looking back at those seating charts, well, yes, it gave me that option, but those two should not be sitting next to each other. I know these two kids.
That's right.
Those should be on the opposite corners. So I need to tweak that a little bit. But I think, if we can empower technology to, I can't remember which one of the show guests that mentioned this to me, and I absolutely stuck with it, is it gives us a great starting point for the creativity. As you said, is that great power is there's no more such thing as writer's block. There's no such thing as how do I get started on this? All right, give me some starting points. And I think that that's a wonderful thing to go. Let me
Can I explore one more thing there with you?
Please. Yeah, go ahead.
So just one, so a very specific example, as I spoke in broad terms, a specific example there. We did some work with principals over the summer, this summer. And they were specifically looking at, could we build it like a custom GPT within ChatGPT that would help them with their observations and evaluations for teachers? So the goal of observations, right? Typically, principal walks into a class, stands for 10 to 20 minutes, observes a particular lesson, has a framework and a rubric that they're assessing the teacher on. And then they traditionally, historically, most school districts, those principals then have to fill out some paperwork that captures their notes. They put it into a particular form. They identify elements from the rubric that the teacher did well, elements there's opportunity for improvement. Every district uses different language, but the construct's generally the same. And then the most important thing that needs to be done happens. The principal sits with the teacher and has a conversation, and they actually talk about growing that teacher's craft, right? It's a uniquely human experience. So what we did this summer was we looked to see how, given that there's a predetermined set of criteria, a rubric and a framework, could we use those and then the notes from the principal for the class while they were doing the observation to essentially radically expedite the paperwork side of the observation? It's a predetermined form we wanted. We knew what the kind of language we wanted in the response. It just needed to reflect the notes and be reflective of the rubric and the framework. So we built that tool. It was very easy. I mean, built the tool sounds like we did something fancy. We wrote 3 prompts and it wrote, the GPT wrote itself in 5 minutes. And now we've got principals that are using that. And the feedback I've gotten from principals, in fact, just had this conversation yesterday with an elementary school principal from an inner city school. He said, observations used to take me about an hour and a half to complete after the observation. It's been about an hour and 15 minutes doing the paperwork and then the 15-minute conversation. He said, now, since I'm using the tool, that takes me about 15 minutes to complete the paperwork and refine it and get it in my voice. And I get to spend about 30 minutes in conversation with the teacher. And the magic happens in the conversation. And what GPT is helping me do is it's cutting an hour and 15 minutes off my process. So it's made the granular bit way more efficient and bought time, right? It's liberated him to spend more time doing that piece, which is uniquely human, right? To build that human connection, to build that relationship and really grow his teachers. I think that's where I get most excited. I know that's not the singular use of any of these chatbots or where generative AI goes, but man, in the human development world, that's a big deal.
No, I mean, I think you brought up those 2 items, right? We're buying back our time. And I think there's so much time between meetings that we don't want to be a part of or filling out paperwork that I especially love when you have to do the same paperwork in 2 different formats, aka government forms or something like that. But I mean, I think we get to the point where we don't need to do that, right? But I think the other one is taking that and empowering us to use that with a human connection, human touch, human experience. And as much as we said, we want the 20-somethings, to deliver value sooner. So you have a young teacher, but there is such a thing as a principal who's been in the classroom for 20 years and administrator for another decade, being able to take that data and say, hey, look, I know you're struggling with this. Here's some things I dealt with. Let me share my real life experiences on classroom discipline or whatever it may be.
It's that exactly. That's right.
Yeah. And you're also not bogged down, because I know, having had to do performance reviews in the corporate world, if I'm spending 3 hours prepping for my performance reviews, I'm not going to spend 30 minutes with them. But if I can cut that down to an hour, then I can give extra time and still have the energy in the day to get everything else done. You mentioned assessment, and you and I talked about this before we started the recording. How do we, and let's be creative problem solvers here, in corporate world and education, we always love assess things, right? We're not going to talk about standardized testing or anything like that. But in general, we always assess people's skills, and we assess skills that are measurables, right? Everything from basketball, what is his 3-point shooting percentage, or, all these other things. How do we, and perhaps using technology, start assessing those essential skills that are not as measurable, right? those
Yeah.
things that we actually know we need to grow and survive.
So we didn't have this conversation before we got on the call, started recording, but my team is actually in the process. We've just rolled out an app that helps with this in the K-12 and in the business context. So it's a micro-credentialing app, and we actually started with technical skills in mind. How do we assess and give feedback on student development, employee development of technical skills? But as we were doing it, our work had always been centered around in K-12, those essential skills. So we started looking to go, how could we do this? And I think you're all over it in the frame of the question, in that technical skills, or in education, we have to call this content mastery. Right? Content mastery is relatively easy to quantify. We can give a test, we can use an instrument.
Sure.
We can pretty quickly quantify, like, yes, this person has X level of expertise on this content. But the world doesn't really value content expertise, right? That's a piece. That's a piece for sure. I've got 4 kids in school. Like, I do want them learning reading, writing, arithmetic. They need to know how to, do multiplication. There's things they need to know. So, like, that's a valuable piece. I'm not discounting that, but it's not the only piece. Right? But historically, we've made that it was the easiest to assess. It's been the only piece we've assessed. And as a result, we've built policy around and funding around, like, the content mastery, that which was easily assessed and easily quantified. What we're doing with this app, Fabfolio, which is not the answer, but I think it's an interesting sort of compelling case. They're saying, okay, if we documented, like, if we gave students feedback and essentially assessed their level of mastery of technical proficiency by students doing a project, learners doing a project, and as they engage in a project, they document evidence throughout the project against a known set of criteria. So we might say, I need them to be a level 1 programmer in C++. All right. So we would define what are those criteria to be a level 1 programmer. We might have to drill down. We might say, actually, I need to really assess their ability to navigate conditionals and really drill into what conditionals in that construct looks like. Well, if they document evidence as they're doing real work against that criteria, we give them a micro credential. Okay, like, you've mastered using conditionals at this level in this language, right? Well, we started to think about, like, what would that look like if we said, let's say collaboration through, like, as a skill, right? Do people need to be able to collaborate? Sure. Or I could say communication. People need to communicate? Absolutely. Every business I've ever talked to, what can you find? I got to find employees that can communicate. Communication is critically important. It's listed on every job description ever, right? Well, communication is a category of an essential skill. We drill down and go, well, there's lots of kinds of communication: interpersonal communication, nonverbal, written, public communication, professional, casual, right? There's lots of different sort of subcategories. So we started building out those skills. And when we got granular, if we looked at, say, written communication as a specific kind of communication, then we could create binary criteria. Say, okay, that skill can be broken down into these bits. Same with critical thinking, same with creative problem solving. Can we take a category like critical thinking, break it down into specific skills, and then provide binary list of criteria? Once we've done that, that's a lot of work. Once you get that done, then there's a lot of organizations. America Succeeds I think they're out of Washington, D.C., has been doing some work around, they call it a durable skills framework. It's basically the same concept. They've been doing a lot of work in that space. There's a lot of organizations doing this globally. Once you have that level of detail, then we can turn to a generative AI engine and say, okay, students are documenting evidence, whether they're documenting with pictures or video or text files or PowerPoint, whatever. So you got a collection of evidence, digital files, and you've got a predetermined set of criteria. Generative AI is really, really good at taking a collection of digitized content, analyzing it, right, against a set of criteria, So then it can suddenly help give feedback and validate and really produce reliable results for students and to give them feedback and to help them make informed choice. How do I get better? What do I like? What
Yeah.
am I good at? How do I pursue this? Which is pretty exciting.
Right. And especially when you drilled it down to very specific subsets, you can say, look, here is a very specific weakness. And, I was listening to something, you know who Billy Donovan is, obviously from basketball world. And they talk about, he had a guy had a bad night shooting and went like 2 for 19 shooting. And then he said, well, it was a really bad game. It's like, yeah, but how long did it take you to take those shots? Right. So you were upset about 17 seconds or 34 seconds of your time, but your playing time was 30 minutes. So the
Right.
question is, can you take the extra things you did, the hustle, the encouragement of your teammates and everything you do, and drill it down to those things, and then say, okay, yeah, but here are the things you did well, and here are the things you can work on that are not as tangible as the actual time you lift your hand to take the shot or whatever you're doing. So I think that that's a great way of looking at it. Is I think it's going to take work, and I don't think there's no look. I think we've said two things on every show. We talked about AI and we talk about technology solutions. It's not a magic wand. It's not going to magically solve all your problems. And it's going to take initial work to create the framework for the answers you need. But once you can do it and apply it to your systems, it can simplify and give you so much more granular output than you could do as a human at a lot less time. So, one more quick question for you. And this is kind of a sensitive one. As you're dealing with, and I know you're working with a foundation that deals with a city that has both inner city and more affluent neighborhoods, do you feel technology has created a wider gap of problems when it comes to folks with means and folks without means? And we're not talking about cultural per se, but which I think means matters, right? Obviously, not every school could afford maker spaces, or there's other issues going on in schools, or there's other concerns schools have. Do you feel like technology can actually solve that problem and close the gap between the various stratas of society, or does it create a wider gap?
I think it's a little bit, not to just keep circling back, but it's a little bit of what we talked about already, which is technology is a tool. I mean, in that construct, it's still a tool. So it can be used in either direction. I say oftentimes in the generative AI conversation, like, is it good or bad? Well, the answer is yes. Right? Like it's a tool. I mean, you could make and easily make an argument. The internet in the last 25 years had a profoundly positive impact on society. You don't have to work hard to make a strong argument that the internet has had a profoundly negative impact on society in the same timeline, right? It's a tool that's used by users and has impact. So in the conversation of can technology sort of solve societal and systemic issues, whether it's dealing with privilege, economic status, race, gender, different barriers that we're navigating culturally and across a wide range of cultures, right, and societies. I think the answer is always like, yes, it could have an incredibly positive impact. And concurrently, I've made the argument recently, right, that generative AI, we know the data sets it was trained on largely have bias in those data sets, right? It's inherent in the data set. So bias is inherent in the responses that you get. Like that's going to be a piece of that. I think we have to be mindful of that. I don't think that means we don't use it, but it's one more way we have to be filtering and using the human side of our experience with it to say, okay, let me juxtapose what it's producing with what I know. And it all the more reason calls attention to why we need to be culturally responsive and aware of communities. I think from a resource standpoint, it's incredibly important. This is a conversation I think, particularly in America, we have to be conscientious of with public education. Is the longer we take to craft policies that allow students to use emergent technology, whether it's generative AI or 3D printing or whatever, the more we hesitate and the longer we take to actually integrate those technologies in a meaningful way in the student experience, the more we exacerbate the chasm between the haves and the have-nots. Mm-hmm. I happen to have enough means that my children in my house certainly have access to technology that children in other houses with less means just don't have access to. Generative AI will accelerate that as I provide my students opportunity and access to use this powerful emerging tool, both in my house that students at school, that where school could be the great equalizer, if we're not providing similar levels of access, eventually, then we may see that gap widen. And I think we have to be really mindful of that. That doesn't mean we should go at a pace that's reckless, right? The public school has a responsibility to be responsible for those students and what they're exposing them to. So they should be slower at adopting than I am as a father, but it doesn't mean we don't adopt at all. If we don't adopt at all, I think we run a real risk of setting students behind in a way that just further exacerbates existing challenges.
In some ways, I always look at public education versus, let's say, private education or homeschooling as kind of like the pace of startups versus Fortune 500 companies. Fortune 500 companies are afraid of change in some ways, and because you know what you're doing, right? You seem to have a system, but you're also a lot less efficient, right? We talk about Price's law and some other laws of economics that apply there. Yet startups, they're willing to iterate, and keep solving, and keep changing, keep adopting. And I think that that's an important balance to strike, for bigger education systems versus how you do it at home. I've also will say this, having lived internationally, I will say that there are definitely cultural challenges when adapting technology. Most of it is mostly working in English. There's so much of it that's not available outside of English. Now it's growing rapidly, and then I think available. I looked at Gemini. I think it's 18 languages that you can use it now, but it's 18 out of hundreds. So
Right.
there's definitely challenges that are still ahead for us. Michael, I'll give you a final word. Help me kind of. I don't want a bright future hope per se, but just where do you see hope in the way we are treating technology as society, especially as you interact with this younger generation and those who touch the younger generation? Give me a hopeful output here.
Yeah. I mean, I think at the end of the day, right, it's the opportunity to empower students to make more informed decisions about their future and thus our future, like as a species, it has never been stronger. Right? Like what we can equip students to do today is significantly different than what we could equip them to do 25 years ago. Right? I have no idea. I'd be foolish to guess and speculate at what 25 years from now looks like. But we know the current generation of students in our schools is they're very mindful of they're very aware of cultural differences, and increasingly they're globally minded. They're thoughtful about what we do and how we steward our environment and the resources around us. So there's some real hope there that as students get their head around like sort of what's possible with technology and begin applying that technology, not just for the sake of using it, but to actually solve meaningful problems. Like, I don't know what problem they're going to solve. There's plenty of problems that need addressed, but I think we're headed into a future where our capacity, the potential to solve problems, no question lies in our students' hands. And I think the technology is going to just enhance at a radical scale the kinds of problems and the kinds of solutions that are possible. That gets me going. That gets me going in the morning. I get excited about thinking about what my own children will do and what their classmates will do.
Yeah, that's powerful. I think giving them the power to make the world a better place, even with the new tools that we can't even imagine, I think that's powerful and exciting. Michael, thank you very much for your time. Everybody else, thank you for listening to another episode of Tectonic Lounge. Keep tuning in. We come out weekly. We will have more exciting guests who keep bringing different perspective to technology solutions to business and educational problems. Hope everybody has a great day.